I never believed silence could make so much noise until it began living inside my house. I am Maribel Rosas, a mother from San Antonio, Texas, and this is not a story I wanted to tell, but it is a story that grew inside my daughter and almost destroyed her. My daughter's name is Alessandra Rosas, my only child, my breath, my unfinished prayer. I noticed the change in her long before I understood the reason. A mother always does. It starts quietly, like a shadow learning how to walk. Alessandra used to laugh loudly, the kind of laugh that filled rooms and spilled into hallways. She loved late-night tea, old songs, and telling me about college gossip as if it were world news. Then one morning, her smile stayed in bed while she came to breakfast alone. Her eyes avoided mine, her phone never left her hand, and every vibration made her shoulders stiffen. At first, I thought it was stress, maybe studies, maybe a broken heart she didn't want to name. I chose patience, because that is what mothers do before fear teaches them better lessons. Days passed, and the silence grew heavier. She stopped eating properly. Her skin lost color. Sleep became a stranger to her eyes. Sometimes I would wake up at night and hear her crying softly, the kind of crying meant to hide pain, not release it. When I asked, she would say she was fine, that I worried too much. But a mother knows when fine is a lie wearing makeup. The phone call started after that. Always at odd hours. Always unknown numbers. She would answer, walk into another room, and return pale, trembling, broken in places I couldn't see but deeply felt. One evening, I watched her hands shake so badly that she dropped her teacup. That sound, porcelain breaking against the floor, broke something inside me too. For days, I said nothing. I watched. I listened. I prayed. Until one afternoon, while Alessandra was in the shower, her phone began ringing on the kitchen counter. Unknown number again. It rang and rang, impatient, aggressive, like it owned the right to be answered. My heart pounded as I picked it up. I didn't speak. I only listened. A male voice filled the silence. Cold. Confident. Cruel. He spoke as if my daughter were his property's property, threatening, demanding, reminding her of consequences if she didn't meet him. He said her name like he owned it. I felt my blood freeze, but I stayed quiet, absorbing every word, every tone, every pause. When the call ended, my hands were numb, but my mind was painfully clear. Someone was hunting my child. That night, I didn't sleep. When Alessandra came to breakfast, I didn't ask gently anymore. I asked honestly. I told her I knew. I told her I had answered the phone. Her strength collapsed instantly. She cried like a child again, not a grown woman pretending to survive. She told me everything. About the messages. The blackmail. The fear. The shame. The threats. The demand to meet. The way he controlled her life without touching her once. I held her face and promised her something I would later bleed to keep. I promised her she would not face this alone. The next morning, I went to the San Antonio Police Department. I told them everything. Every call. Every message. Every fear. They listened carefully, professionally, and with urgency. A plan was formed, slow and precise. I agreed to do whatever it took to protect my daughter. Even if it meant becoming someone else for a while. The meeting place was a small cafe near Austin Highway, ordinary, crowded, perfect for hiding the truth in plain sight. The police dressed me as a waitress. I learned the layout, the exits, the timing. Alessandra would not come. I would be there instead, watching, waiting, listening. When the day arrived, my heart felt too large for my chest. I wiped tables, poured coffee, and watched every man who entered. Then he walked in. And the world tilted. I recognized him before my mind allowed the truth. His face carried familiarity, something painfully known. When he looked up, our eyes met, and I saw it clearly. The boy who had been threatening my daughter was Gabriel Montoya, her cousin, from El Paso, Texas, the boy who used to sit at our dinner table, who used to call me aunt, who used to say he loved her. That moment didn't end the story. It only cracked it open. Seeing Gabriel Montoya standing there in that cafe felt like watching a memory turn into a weapon. My hands kept moving, wiping tables, pouring coffee, pretending the world hadn't just shifted under my feet, but inside me something ancient and ferocious woke up. This was not just a stranger anymore, this was family, blood, someone I had trusted enough to leave alone with my child. I watched him sit by the window, checking his phone again and again, impatience written all over his face, as if the right to demand obedience had always belonged to him. The police officers, dressed as customers, stayed still, waiting for my signal, but I needed to understand first, because a mother needs to know what poison touched her child before she can pull it out. He ordered coffee. His voice was calm, almost polite, the same voice that once asked me for seconds at dinner. I placed the cup in front of him, my fingers steady despite the storm inside me. He looked up, confused at first, then startled, then pale. Recognition hit him like a slap. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For a moment, the predator disappeared, replaced by a frightened boy trapped in his own cruelty. I leaned closer, my voice low and controlled, telling him that he would not speak, that he would listen, because for months my daughter had been forced to do the same. His eyes darted around the cafe, sensing danger, sensing consequence, sensing that control was slipping from his hands. I told him I knew everything. The messages. The threats. The lies disguised as love. He tried to speak, to explain, to justify, but I cut him off. Love does not destroy health. Love does not steal sleep. Love does not make a girl fear her own phone. I reminded him that the police were there, watching, recording, waiting for a single wrong move. His shoulders collapsed. The power he had borrowed from secrecy returned to where it belonged, leaving him small, exposed, and trembling. When the officers approached, he didn't resist. He looked at me one last time, eyes full of regret and something close to obsession, and I felt no pity. Only clarity. He confessed quickly, not because he was brave, but because he was cornered. He admitted that his feelings for Alessandra had turned into obsession, that rejection had fermented into control, that he believed fear would keep her close. Hearing this did not shock me, it confirmed what I already knew. Entitlement is the most dangerous form of love. That evening, I brought Alessandra home. She sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, looking smaller than she had ever looked. I told her everything gently, carefully, choosing words like stitches meant to close a wound, not tear it wider. She cried again, but this time the tears were different. These tears carried relief, not terror. She asked me if it was over. I told her the truth, that the worst part was, but healing takes longer than rescue. The following weeks were quiet, but not empty. We attended counseling together in New Braunfels, learned how trauma leaves fingerprints on the mind, how fear doesn't vanish just because danger does. Alessandra had nightmares. Sudden sounds still made her flinch. Some days she couldn't leave her room. Other days she sat in sunlight, breathing slowly, relearning safety. I stayed close, not hovering, not forcing, just present. Healing, I learned, grows better when it isn't rushed. Gabriel was warned, legally and clearly, to stay away. The family was told only what needed to be told. I refused to carry shame that didn't belong to us. Protection is not disgrace, silence is. Alessandra slowly returned to herself, not the girl she was before, but a stronger version shaped by survival. She began eating again, sleeping again, laughing again, softly at first, like laughter testing its legs. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the Texas sky darken into stars, she rested her head on my shoulder and said something I will carry forever. She said, "You believed me before I could believe myself." That was enough. That will always be enough. But our story does not end here. Because survival is not the ending. It is the beginning of becoming someone new. And the next chapter would test us in ways I never expected. Time does not heal wounds the way people promise it does, it only gives you space to learn how to live with the scars. After everything that happened, our house in San Antonio felt different, as if the walls themselves were trying to remember how to breathe again. Alessandra moved through the rooms carefully, like someone relearning a familiar place after an earthquake. She was safer now, but safety and peace are not twins, they grow at different speeds. I watched her closely, not with fear anymore, but with attention, the kind that waits instead of chasing. She decided to return to college in Austin, a choice that scared me more than I admitted. Part of me wanted to keep her close forever, wrap her in routine and predictability, but another part understood that protection is not ownership. Strength needs space to stretch. We talked long into the nights, weighing fear against independence, until she finally said she needed to go back, not to escape the past, but to face the world on her own terms. I agreed, though my heart protested every mile of distance. The first weeks were difficult. Her calls were frequent, her voice careful, always checking if I was still there on the other end. I reassured her again and again that I was, that I always would be. Slowly, the calls became lighter. She talked about classes, friends, small victories like walking alone without panic or answering unknown numbers without shaking. Each detail felt like a medal pinned quietly onto her courage. Then one afternoon, she came home unexpectedly. She didn't call ahead. She didn't smile. She sat at the kitchen table, fingers intertwined so tightly her knuckles were white. I felt it instantly, that familiar heaviness, the kind that announces trouble before words do. She told me that Gabriel had tried to reach out through mutual relatives, claiming therapy, regret, transformation. He had sent messages meant to sound harmless, but they reopened wounds that hadn't fully closed. She hadn't replied, but the fear returned anyway, uninvited and stubborn. I reminded her that healing does not mean never being afraid again, it means knowing what to do when fear shows up. We reviewed everything the police had taught us. Boundaries. Documentation. Silence where silence protects. I watched her shoulders relax as control returned to her hands. This was not the same girl who once hid her pain behind forced smiles. This was a woman learning to stand her ground. Around that time, I began speaking at a small community center in Corpus Christi, sharing our story anonymously with other parents. I didn't name names. I didn't chase sympathy. I shared warning signs, the quiet changes, the danger of assuming family is always safe. Each time I spoke, I felt the weight lift just a little. Pain, when shared with purpose, loses its sharpest edge. Alessandra attended one of those talks without telling me. When I saw her sitting in the back row, listening, eyes steady, something inside me shifted. Later that night, she told me she wanted to help too. Not as a victim, but as a voice. She began volunteering, answering hotline messages, guiding girls who felt trapped by fear and manipulation. Watching her turn her trauma into a bridge for others was the most powerful transformation I have ever witnessed. But life has a way of testing resolve when it thinks you've grown comfortable. One evening, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside were words carefully chosen to sound calm, apologetic, final. Gabriel was leaving Texas, he wrote. Starting over. Asking for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. I read it twice, then burned it. Closure does not always come from answers, sometimes it comes from refusal. That night, Alessandra slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. I sat by the window, watching the city lights, understanding something deeply true. Saving your child is not a single act. It is 1,000 quiet decisions made every day, even when the danger seems gone. And just when I believed we had reached calm waters, life prepared one final wave that would redefine what strength truly meant. The wave I sensed came disguised as opportunity, which is how danger often returns when it fails the first time. Alessandra received an offer for an internship in Houston, a respected nonprofit working with women who had survived harassment and digital abuse. When she told me, her eyes were shining with purpose, not fear, and that alone told me how far she had come. Still, my chest tightened. Houston was bigger, faster, more anonymous. Healing teaches courage, but motherhood never unlearns worry. We talked for hours, weighing everything again. This time, the conversation was different. She wasn't asking permission, she was sharing her decision. I saw strength in the way she spoke, clarity in the way she planned, caution without panic. I helped her pack, folding clothes, labeling documents, doing the ordinary things that carry extraordinary love. When I hugged her goodbye, I realized something painful and beautiful at the same time. She no longer needed me to stand in front of her. She needed me behind her. Weeks passed smoothly. She called often, her voice steady, describing work that mattered, stories that mirrored her own in fragments. She was careful, aware, grounded. I allowed myself to breathe again. Then one night, past midnight, my phone rang. I recognized the silence on the other end before the voice arrived. Alessandra was crying, but not in fear. In anger. She told me someone at the organization had leaked her story without consent. Not names, not details, but enough. Enough for whispers. Enough for recognition. Enough to remind her how fragile trust can be. I listened, letting her rage pour out, not interrupting, not correcting. This was her battle now, and she was fighting it standing upright. The next morning, she confronted them. She demanded accountability. She refused to be quiet. They apologized, formally and publicly. Policies were rewritten. Boundaries reinforced. Watching her from afar, I felt pride sharper than any fear I had ever known. This was not survival anymore. This was leadership born from pain. Around the same time, I began writing. At first, it was private. Pages filled with memories, mistakes, moments I wished I had noticed sooner. Then those pages became letters, then articles, then invitations to speak beyond Texas. I spoke in Dallas, Laredo, El Paso, telling parents to trust their instincts, to listen beyond words, to understand that danger doesn't always look like strangers in the dark. Sometimes it looks like family at the table. Alessandra returned home for the holidays. She looked older, calmer, steadier. Not hardened, but refined, like metal shaped by fire. We cooked together, laughed, remembered simpler times without needing to erase the complicated ones. One evening, she asked me something unexpected. She asked if I ever blamed myself. The question sat between us like a fragile object. I told her the truth. Yes, sometimes. Mothers are human before they are heroes. But blame, I explained, is useful only when it teaches. After that, it must be released. She reached across the table and held my hand, and in that moment, the roles felt equal. Two women. Two survivors. Two voices choosing light. That night, as the house slept, I understood that the story we were living was no longer about fear or rescue. It was about transformation. And transformations always ask for one final test before they settle into truth. The final tests never announce themselves, they arrive quietly, pretending to be ordinary days. It was early spring when Alessandra told me she had been accepted into a graduate program in Dallas, Texas, focused on digital safety and victim advocacy. Her voice carried excitement, but also a deep seriousness, the kind that comes from knowing your path is chosen, not accidental. I smiled, congratulated her, celebrated her future, but inside I felt the familiar ache of letting go again. Each step forward for a child is a step backward for a mother's illusion of control. Dallas changed her in ways I didn't expect. She became more confident, more measured. She spoke less, but when she did, her words carried weight. She learned how systems work, how laws are written, how silence is enforced, and how it can be broken responsibly. Our phone calls became discussions rather than reassurances. She wasn't asking me how to survive anymore, she was asking how to make things better for others. Then one afternoon, a name resurfaced. Gabriel Montoya. Not through contact, not through family, but through a case file Alessandra encountered during her studies. Different state. Different girl. Same pattern. My heart dropped when she told me, not because I feared his return to our lives, but because I saw how cycles repeat when consequences are too gentle. Alessandra didn't panic. She documented. she reported. She followed protocol with precision that impressed even her professors. This time, she wasn't the girl being targeted. She was the woman building the walls. The investigation moved forward without our involvement, and I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before, closure that didn't depend on confrontation. Justice doesn't always knock loudly, sometimes it arrives through paperwork and persistence. Alessandra told me she didn't need to see him face to face again. She had already reclaimed what mattered. During this period, my own voice grew stronger too. I was invited to collaborate on a statewide awareness program in Austin, working with parents, educators, and law enforcement. I spoke not as a victim's mother anymore, but as a witness to transformation. I emphasized prevention over reaction, listening over assumptions. Every time I spoke, I saw faces change, just slightly, just enough to matter. One evening, Alessandra came home for a short visit. We sat on the porch again, just like before, but the silence felt different now. Comfortable. Earned. She told me she forgave Gabriel, not for him, but for herself. Forgiveness, she said, was not permission, it was release. I listened, proud of her clarity, grateful she understood what took me years to learn. She asked me if I would ever stop worrying. I laughed, because some truths don't need philosophy. I told her no, but that worry had learned how to walk beside trust now, not ahead of it. She rested her head on my shoulder, just for a moment, and I felt the full circle close softly. As she drove away the next morning, I realized the story was nearing its end, not because pain was forgotten, but because it no longer owned us. What remained was purpose, shaped by love and tested by fire. Only one chapter remained, the one where beginnings finally learn how to rest. Some endings do not feel like endings at all, they feel like quiet mornings after a long storm, when the sky is still heavy but no longer threatening. That was how life began to feel after Dallas. Alessandra completed her graduate program with distinction, not because she chased recognition, but because she worked with a kind of discipline that only lived experience can teach. She no longer introduced herself as someone who had survived something. She introduced herself as someone who knew how to protect others. She accepted a position with a digital safety task force based in Fort Worth, working closely with law enforcement and schools. The irony was not lost on either of us. Once, the police had stood beside me to protect my child. Now, my child stood beside them to protect many others. When she told me, her voice was calm, grounded, confident. No tremor. No doubt. I sat in silence after the call ended, letting that reality settle into my bones. Around the same time, I was invited to testify at a policy hearing in Austin, contributing to legislation focused on cyber harassment and blackmail prevention. I stood in that room not as a broken mother, but as a witness to what happens when protection meets courage. I spoke clearly, without drama, without anger. Facts, patterns, consequences. When I finished, there was no applause, but there was understanding, and that felt stronger. Alessandra attended that hearing without telling me again. When I saw her afterward, waiting outside, smiling softly, I felt something loosen inside my chest. She hugged me tightly and whispered that I had saved her life. I corrected her gently. I told her I had only stood in the doorway, she had walked through it herself. We both knew it was true. That night, we talked about the past openly, without fear of reopening wounds. We talked about mistakes, about moments that could have gone differently, about how close we came to losing each other to silence. There was no blame in the conversation, only understanding. That, I realized, was the real healing. Months passed. The world moved forward. Gabriel's name faded into background noise, no longer sharp, no longer powerful. Alessandra built routines, friendships, a life defined by intention rather than reaction. She laughed freely again, deeply, fully. Sometimes I caught myself watching her the way I used to when she was a child, amazed by her existence. One evening, she called me with news that felt symbolic. She had been asked to mentor young women entering the field, girls who carried fear in their voices the way she once did. She asked me if I thought she was ready. I didn't answer immediately. I thought of that first unknown call, the shaking hands, the silence. Then I told her the truth. She had been ready the moment she chose not to disappear. As I hung up, I understood something profound. A mother's job is not to shield her child from the world forever. It is to teach her how to stand when the world tries to push her down. I had done that. And she had done the rest. Only one part of our story remains, the part where everything finally comes to rest, not in forgetting, but in peace. There comes a moment in every long journey when you stop measuring how far you still have to go and begin honoring how far you have already come. For me, that moment arrived on an ordinary Sunday morning in San Antonio, sunlight slipping quietly through the curtains, the house filled with a calm I once believed we would never know again. Alessandra was home for a visit, sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, scrolling through notes for a workshop she was preparing. There was no fear in her posture, no weight in her breath. Just presence. Just peace. We cooked breakfast together, moving around each other with an ease shaped by years of shared survival. The past was no longer something we avoided or feared mentioning. It existed, acknowledged, respected, but no longer in control. After breakfast, we sat on the porch, the same place where so many chapters of our healing had quietly unfolded. The Texas sky stretched wide above us, endless and forgiving. Alessandra told me about a young girl she had recently helped, someone who reminded her of herself in ways that still ached. She spoke not with pain, but with purpose, explaining how she listened, how she waited, how she believed. As I listened, I realized something that brought tears to my eyes. The fear that once threatened to destroy my daughter had been transformed into a compass, guiding her toward others who needed light. Later that day, as she prepared to leave, she hugged me longer than usual. Not because she was afraid to go, but because she understood what it meant to stay connected without being dependent. She thanked me, not just for protecting her, but for trusting her when it was time to let go. I told her something I had never said out loud before. I told her that being her mother was the greatest responsibility of my life, but also the greatest education. When she drove away, I didn't stand at the window with worry anymore. I cleaned the kitchen, watered the plants, and sat down to write. I wrote our story not as a warning, but as a testament. A testament to what happens when silence is broken, when mothers listen beyond words, when daughters are believed before they are blamed. This story does not end with justice or punishment or revenge. It ends with something quieter and far more powerful, resilience. Alessandra did not return to who she was before. She became someone stronger, wiser, and deeply compassionate. And I did not remain the same mother I once was. I became braver, louder, and more willing to stand in uncomfortable truths. If there is one thing I want the world to know, it is this: protection begins with attention, and healing begins with belief. A mother's love is not perfect, but when it is fierce, present, and willing to learn, it can change the direction of a life. This is not just my daughter's story. It is the story of every voice that refused to stay silent. And it is the story of how love, when it stands firm, always finds its way home.